Good afternoon, everyone. Warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for making your way here on a Sunday afternoon to our public forum, Theatre Reviews, Last Word or the Start of a Conversation. I'm Kathy Rowland from ArtsEquator, and I'll be moderating today's forum. So our panelist to my left is Lyn Gardner, a theatre critic from The Guardian, who's been here for the past 5 days running workshops. We then have Sean Tobin, who is the artistic director of the M1 Singapore Fringe Festival. Corrie Tan, who is a theatre critic and as of last week, the editor at ArtsEquator. And Alfian Sa'at, who is a playwright, resident playwright of Wild Rice Theatre. Please join me giving everyone a warm welcome. So we're going to keep it quite informal. We'd like to just kind of start off with Lyn giving some comments to the topic, and then the other three panelists will respond and we'll get a conversation going. We'll end with about half an hour of questions and answers or comments from the room. Lyn?
Thank you. The British playwright John Osborne once suggested that playwrights and theatre makers thought as fondly of theatre critics as a lamppost thinks of dogs. I would kind of go, oh, I think that is really outdated thinking. Yeah. It kind of pits critics against artists in a way that I think serves no purpose and does very little to help support a strong and ambitious theatre culture. And I think that's particularly true in an age in which the cultural shifts of the internet means that theatre criticism is facing quite a lot of challenges. I think the good news is the fact that new platforms mean that new voices and bloggers of all ages and backgrounds are writing about theatre, and often, not always, but often writing about it really, really well. I think what we have is a kind of tsunami of writing going on, whereas once for many people, even if you were kind of university educated, the truth were, unless you were a kind of middle manager and wrote reports, or else actually you became a novelist or a journalist, you simply never had the platform, even if you had a real enthusiasm for theatre or whatever it was, to kind of write about it. That has changed. Now the platform is absolutely available for you. I think the bad news is that the economic woes of the mainstream media that have seen their advertising revenues all kind of drift off to Facebook and Google mean that in their pages and on their sites, arts coverage, particularly actually I think theatre coverage, is, unless it is really high profile stuff, is under threat. What is reviewed tends to be what is valued in a culture. And I think that therefore, the fact that those reviews are being cut is actually a problem. To use the old chestnut, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? If a theatre piece is staged and it received no review coverage, what does it mean for those artists' futures? Reviews are often a way for programmers and funders to find out about artists' work about which otherwise they might have little prior knowledge. It's impossible, often even for funders, to get round and see absolutely everything. I think that's why it's really important that that we position ourselves as midwives and not as gatekeepers. And I think perhaps looking back when kind of John Osborne was talking about critics kind of 40 years ago, I think that was because critics more often did position themselves as gatekeepers. I think our job is not to police theatre, but to say this, or to say this is what I think theatre is, but rather to work alongside artists to to ask what it is that theatre might be. And I think it's important that it's a loud and ongoing conversation between artists and critics, and one that is as much about the interrogation of process as it is about product. I think that's kind of a really crucial thing. And I think that one of the things is that at a time when it appears that theatre criticism is in crisis, what the internet has done is open up the possibility that when a critic writes a review, it is simply the start of a conversation rather than the last word on any production. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Lyn. Would one of you like to respond to that? Or perhaps just share, the things that are at the front of your mind now as we start the conversation.
Yeah, I guess building on what Lyn was saying, I guess what I think is most useful when we talk about theatre criticism is this consciousness that we are starting a conversation that will then be built on. So sometimes I think critical questions and critical and sensitive contextualizing of the work is what's most valuable, and not this end that the conversation is over and this is final and this is absolute and in print. So what's valuable to me as a theatre maker and a festival programmer is how theatre can and should be inseparable from the tapestry of society, right? So we want to know that when they walk out of the theatre, they'll keep thinking, they'll keep talking, they'll be able to, audience will find words to describe their experiences, find ways to develop their thoughts, find ways to allow the artwork to echo through everyday experience. I think a lot of people leave the theatre and feel like if they don't want to talk about it, it's because they don't necessarily feel they have authority or vocabulary or context. So I think a critic can help with that. I've been thinking a little bit too about how it might mirror the role of the dramaturg in the dramaturg in the rehearsal and creation process kind of helps sharpen the use of language and staging and thought and building context. And I think the theatre critic can almost kind of help with a dramaturgy of conversation about the dramaturgy, so to speak. Maybe I'll just leave it there for now.
Yeah, but I think there's also a distinction to be made between theatre critic as what you said, kind of dramaturgy of vocabulary and critical discussion, and also when the critic attempts to be the dramaturg of the play, which is of course not, I think, what should be happening. Where very often we see reviews where the theatre critic says, "Oh, if only this person had done such and such, this play would be so much better," and attempts to shape the work according to what they think the work ought to be, instead of responding to the work as it is. Right, and I think that there also comes a debate about the distinction between personal taste, what the critic likes or dislikes, as opposed to what the work is and how it's situated in the context it is in, the artist's trajectory, the country it's in. And I think when I started out, I would consider myself a very young reviewer. But when I first started out, I think I often looked at reviewing when I was with the Straits Times as kind of an arbiter of taste, right? I like this play because it excelled in such and such areas. I like this, I dislike that. But then I found myself thinking there has to be more than a discussion of what I like and what I don't like, and who am I to dictate the terms of what should be liked or disliked. And I think about 2 years in, I was speaking to a few theatre practitioners, and I realized the great kind of thirst for someone who understood context and could respond to work within context and not just say, this was great about this work, and produce a quotable quote for the theatre company to put on their website as marketing. I think it goes beyond that discussion about marketing work or pushing work. And it was quite interesting because I've just come back from London, and I've just been observing kind of the differences between how reviews, the sphere of reviews there and the sphere of reviews here. So when we go to a press night here, in the past at least, I mean, I think now it's different. There would just be maybe 4 reviewers in the crowd, and I'd be one of them, and I'm like, oh, I feel so, like, it's quite monolithic, you know, you just go to 4 people, and these are the views that you hear. Whereas it was quite a privilege to be in London, to be at a press night, and there are 50 people writing about the same show. That thing brings up a different set of issues, but, you know, it was, wow, there's an enormous conversation at work here, and the artist is not so reliant on a single review to make or break a show. And so the relationship is also quite different. And there's also room for reviews that are more experimental. I think because I came from a more mainstream background, now I'm discovering the pleasures of taking more time with my writing. And writing in different styles as well, because I think in a mainstream paper you tend to follow a certain format of critical engagement, where you know, you say something, make a statement about the work, and then you kind of describe the context a little bit and name drop a little bit, and then you shoehorn something in about what the performers are doing, and then you have like a pithy last line, and they're like, oh, 400 words, I made it. And I think, you know, with digital media and various platforms, and, you know, something I'm hoping to do at ArtsEquator as well is to look at different kinds of critical engagement that don't necessarily follow, you know, that format. And I think Alfian has done some lovely stuff where he's been to Bangkok recently, and he's written for us, let's say, combining several shows in a single piece. So he's looking at the resonances and kind of themes between, there's a conversation between works in the same city, looking at different issues, or similar issues in different ways, and things like that. And I'm interested in those kinds of conversations, which, of course, you know, also requires a sound knowledge of theatre and dramatic work. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so okay. So obviously, I think I want to address the role of the critic and the importance of criticism and reviews in public life and civic life. So obviously, that's the kind of conversation and the feedback that you need, I think, as part of the discourse on art making. This is also a very important point, which for me is the idea of the archive. So in many instances, because theatre is so ephemeral, you need that archive, right? And theatre companies will have their own private archive, so to speak, because they'll video, but not all companies have this kind of resources. And then sometimes the companies dissolve, and then the archive actually disappears. Yeah. So actually, these theatre reviews play a very important part as documentation, and also they are a much more public archive. So they're searchable, and I think this is why sometimes there's this anxiety that this public archive not capture a distorted picture of what the production is like. So I think this is why, for some artists, I think they get a little bit needled when they think, oh, you know, why is it such a bad review? Was it really like that? And then, you know, that thing has this kind of what is a bit of an outsized importance because it becomes documentation and then archive for the future.
Sorry, can I just respond to that? That's so important because also as a researcher myself, when going back to, I recently wrote a survey of the Wild Rice pantomime in Singapore, kind of history of the Wild Rice pantomime, and I went to look up reviews of the shows that even though I had seen them, just kind of refresh my memory, and it made me really miss the Flying Ink Pot, and I know the founders are here in the audience today, which was this really wonderful archive of theatre reviews, and it was just, I depended largely on that to get a sense of what the works were like. And when I was in London, I had the privilege of spending a few months working with the Victoria and Albert Museum in their theatre archive section. And I mean, it was like a paradise. I was specifically digitizing the work of this group called Monstrous Regiment, who did a lot of Carol Churchill, Bernie Lavery. And it was so fascinating to document their work and look at 12 different reviews and how how the male-dominated circuit regarded their work as like strident or you know, and how then you see the dynamic slowly shifting over the years, and it maybe says more about the public and who receives it and the tastemakers of that period rather than the work itself. And it's interesting to see that and it's so wonderful that they do have a snapshot of how each work was responded to. And at this point, I think there are a few theatre groups with individual independent archives, but there's no kind of one place that we can all go to and see, oh my gosh, this is how that work was responded to in 1975, for example. And that's kind of a long-term vision of what reviewing is, why it's important. And you can really tell what review is useful for your research and what is not. There's some reviews that I read from papers that won't be named that really give you no sense of what the production was about, and it's really a struggle to find out more about the context it was performed in, what it was responding to, and things like that. So I echo your need for a public archive as a kind of archive of record of work.
I mean, I think that's absolutely really important. I began my career reviewing on a now defunct London magazine called City Limits, which was in fact a breakaway from Time Out magazine. The entire staff of Time Out walked out of Time Out and set up its own magazine in a dispute about parity. It was, for the time, the largest publishing co-op in Europe for 10 years. But one of the things that was interesting about that is that we reviewed things that nobody else was reviewing. And I think that comes back to that point of, that what is reviewed tends to be what is valued in the culture. So one of the things I think that critics and actually editors need to think about very hard is, if they cannot review everything, what is it that they actually are reviewing, and what it is that they are choosing to review. So I think that's a kind of, a very important point in terms that actually critics are being kind of tastemakers before they have even written a word. Yeah.
So just to add to that, this sense that you are, in a sense, creating a public archive is very important, which is why when I look at reviews, I always appreciate the ones that also try to describe the work, so that the review is not just a record of the subjective tastes of the reviewer at that moment in time, but it's also a record of actually the work itself. In the absence of, say, a video recording, etc., you have a sense just from reading the review, okay, this is what happened, there were these many actors on stage, the lighting was like this, etc.
But Alfian, sometimes you'll find that, one of the common criticisms is that it's just a summary of the play,
yes.
right?
So you need to have that balance, right? So, I mean, you can't have something that's purely analytical without giving it that prior context. But at the same time also, it helps to give the reader a picture of what you are going to eventually analyze or critique.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an element that one of the things perhaps that you're always striving to do as a critic, and of course mostly failing, is actually to give people who were not there a sense of what it might have been to be there in some ways. Yeah.
Can I ask each of you, so Corrie and actually Alfian as well, because you write, and then who is your imagined reader when you write?
Go.
Yeah, I've heard this question before, and I mean, I don't specifically have sometimes I don't have a specific person in mind when
Can I ask though,
yes.
Is your imagined reader the same reader as Sumiko Tan's imagined reader?
Alfian.
Listen, we don't aim so
don't.
high.
I mean, because you work for the same paper, this is always, I always have this question, like,
No,
what is
certainly
the
not.
Straits Times reader, or do you feel like you have different readers for different columns?
I definitely feel that. I mean, also, I must add, I'm no
Sorry,
longer
was that
with the Straits
insulting? I'm so sorry. Yes.
It's okay. No, I've had this conversation before, and I think I do write for an informed reader, because I think we know that the pool of people who read reviews tends to be it's quite small in Singapore, honestly, and it's an informed person, and I often think about it as, how would I talk to a friend about a work that I've just seen, but an informed viewer, so someone who has an interest in the work, and I also give some context, perhaps if what the work is referring to is quite specific or quite niche, but it depends on, I think also this question depends on the publication you're writing for. So if you're writing for a mainstream outlet and the audience is a bit broader, and you kind of have to, there's a kind of a denominator you have to aim at, then I think you have to maybe define more terms, be more specific about what you're referring to. But if you're writing for, let's say, for ArtsEquator, which is more niche publication for the informed arts reader, then it's a different target audience as well. Yeah.
So I want to ask, okay, but this is probably before Corrie, right? So at one point of time, when there was a Singapore Festival of the Arts, and then Live, which is Straits Times' lifestyle section, they had this thing called the Fest Pest. Do you remember this?
Yes.
So this fest was this strange, gossipy kind of that wanted to drum up interest in the festival by picking up bits of gossip, you know. Yeah, so, oh, by the way, the Fest heard that there was this screaming match during this particular rehearsal, etc. Yeah, so what is that about? Do you think that's helpful? Do you think that's sort of like playing to a certain kind of readership? What, in your opinion? I'm so sorry, it was before your time, right? It was before. So you take no responsibility for this one. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, so are you asking me a general question about what it's like to be a mainstream reviewer, or?
Yeah,
or?
I suppose like why didn't anyone in the Straits Times, for example, think that this is a bad idea?
I don't know. I mean, I can't answer this question. Unfortunately, I don't know, but it's a good question.
Maybe it's a question we can later put to the audience to see what your, whether it's something that would have piqued your interest, right? I was just listening to the four of you talk, and a couple of things emerges. Is one, there seems to be a dilution of the power of the critic, right? And that's clear across the board, across media, not only in terms of arts media, but generally. But at the same time, so the critic becomes less powerful, less influential, more suspect in some ways, and well, it should be. But at the same time, there also seems to be more demands on the critic to, as some of the things that you've talked about, there's an increased importance, an increased obligation and responsibility, not just to kind of give an opinion, but to facilitate a conversation, to accurately provide some kind of context, to create documentation. And it seems as if, so it feels like we're at this moment where we're trying to also find where our balance is as a critic. How do you all feel? What do you think the skills are that a critic then needs? And as an artist, what irks you the most?
What irks us the most?
Yes, but in the no, I don't want to. We all can come up with many experiences of things, but to have a substantive conversation, let's kind of think of things that can be changed, or things that you feel, you want to communicate to a critic, let's say, or an editor.
I mean, to try and answer that, I would say that I don't think it's a dilution of critics. I think it's just a kind of shift about the place of the critic within the artistic process. And I would say that I think it's one that I really welcome. Quite honestly, there have been very few critics, either through history or in recent times, who, the Frank Riches, the butcher of Broadway, who could close a show overnight in New York. We never in the UK have ever had any critic who was kind of influential in that way. And I think that's a really good thing. But actually, I would go on to say from that I think that one of the things that has actually happened with the arrival of the internet is about the fact that it's widened the critical pool. And I don't know, of course, so much, I know very little about Singapore. This is only my second visit here. But my impression is that there may be some similarities in terms of the fact that certainly in the UK, for a very long time, there were basically about 20 people writing sort of pretty well full-time about theatre, and most of those people would be male, Oxbridge educated, middle class, coming from very particular kinds of backgrounds. And one of the things that's happened now with these new platforms is many more different people are writing, often those are people who actually are both artists and are writing about the work and would see their critical practice as being an extension in some ways of their artistic practice. In a way, as kind of Corrie points out, much as I'd like to deliver my review in the form of a sonnet to The Guardian, I absolutely cannot. I have to kind of, be fulfill the brief. So I think those things have shifted, and I think the other thing that certainly in the UK has shifted is about that point that previously one of those 20 people wrote their review, and that review then exists in the way that you're saying as being the documentation or part of the documentation of that show, but actually may in no way reflect actually what the audience experience of that show was. So, in the past, I could write a show and somehow make it clear throughout the review that I really didn't like it, and nobody could come back on me. Now, actually, I can tell you, within an hour, maybe 100 people would have come back and said, "What is this person talking about? She doesn't know anything," and actually, give their own often extraordinarily perceptive critiques of a show, and I think that is good, and I think we need to encourage that, whether it's in London or whether it's in Singapore, because actually what it does is that I think if you have a strong critical culture, I think it really does encourage a strong theatre culture. If you have a theatre culture that goes unreviewed, I think what you often end up with is work that becomes either complacent or goes down kind of cul-de-sacs, or ends up with the artist kind of itching maybe just their own particular, scab. So I think it can be useful.
Yeah, and to add to the idea of like a critical culture, I think it's very important that reviews they are critiques, and very often, maybe in a smaller community such as that of in Singapore, I think, earlier career reviewers might find it very terrifying to put in a critique of a show, particularly of an established theatre company or production. But I think these critical discussions are really important. We can't constantly have over-generous reviews that gush about work, because that is also unhelpful. But I also think there is a way in which critique can be done generously. It doesn't have to be blistering and scathing and malicious in any way, and it's about finding the balance between, and also whenever you need to critique something, having a really solid understanding of what didn't work and why, being able to justify, not just shredding a work to pieces for the sake of it. So I think that kind of critical discussion is really important. If not, you just get, I don't know what kind of discussions you get from anything else. Yeah.
I mean, because there is a danger that as artists, whether it be artists in the same company with each other, or artist peers, that we may not feel the freedom to be so brutally honest, right? I mean, I think I've mastered the art of walking out of the show that I really dislike, but finding the single positive and honest thing that I can say to that artist, because I just don't think it's the right place to say that was awful and I only stayed because of the air conditioning or something. But having said that, like for me, if an artist does want to talk and hear my views, then I'm very happy to share them, and I want to be honest and not two-faced about it. So it's kind of a time and place thing, yeah. So I think with to have a good critical, healthy conversation about artwork, you need a certain amount of familiarity and a certain amount of distance,
I mean, I think that's very true. I recently wrote a piece in the UK, which was a piece about failure and about why artists do not talk about failure. And of course, the reasons why they don't talk about failure are actually, are in a way kind of perfectly obvious, which is that, it is such a struggle to make a piece of work that you are totally and utterly invested in it. It is hard to admit publicly about failure because it may stop funders. If you say, I didn't think my piece worked, funders may not as well. And about the fact that it may be the case that that it's disrespectful to your colleagues, to talk about the failure of a piece which they have worked on, or indeed to an audience, some of whom may actually have really enjoyed that piece of work and don't want to be told by the artist that it's then a failure. But in a sense, I think that a critic is not kind of constrained by those things, but I think Corrie and Sean are absolutely right that there are ways of actually doing that. And one of the things, really sort of slightly coming back to something that Kathy raised earlier that I think we sort of haven't really perhaps addressed, is about what the shift is that has taken place. And one of the things I would say for me, somebody who has been, writing about theatre for 35 years, is about the fact that in the past, what I always wrote were reviews, and really, unless an artist disagreed with my review and then maybe wrote me a tear-stained letter in green ink saying you are absolutely wrong, it was quite hard to have a dialogue. One of the things that has shifted is that the internet has not just made it possible for an artist to go at the bottom of a review and maybe publicly engage in a dialogue with you, but of course they can immediately just actually send you an email, and I think that any critic worth their salt will absolutely respond to that email, meet with that artist, and I can absolutely say that there have been, artists whose work I have perhaps not positively reviewed, who I've got to know more about that artist's process and the way that they've worked, and then over a period of time actually followed what they've done. And then sometimes I still don't actually like their review, but like the work very much. But there is a kind of respect for each other's point of views, which I think is helpful for the theatre culture, yes, not just for the individuals involved.
So Kathy, your question about skill sets, right? So I think at the barest minimum, you should be able to write. And sometimes we don't have that, unfortunately. I mean, there are people who can't seem to really write what the flow of their argument is or the analysis, whatever. Okay, but also I think there's this huge problem I feel we have in Singapore, which is that we have a newspaper of record, but we don't have a similar, say, critic of record in those newspapers, because there's no sort of like a regular theatre critic, right? So it's been a revolving doors, actually, yeah. I mean, there were some really good ones like Corrie and Clarissa when they were around, but but you're not writing for Straight Science at the moment, yeah. So
I'm very grateful.
Yes. So yeah, are we grateful for her?
I'm great. Sorry, it's stepping out.
Okay. That she's got, you poached her for ArtsEquator. So, but there's this idea that there's not someone who has that kind of institutional memory, and who has sort of followed different theatre companies' work. So I think what happens increasingly in Singapore is that you have theatre companies with quite long histories, 20 years, 30 years, and then you're dealing with a critic with only sort of 5-year immersion in the theatre scene. So there's always that sense of, okay, who's this newcomer, and that's the kind of a relationship, and the potentially hostile one that's established from the start. That said, the skill sets that I would like to see, other than writing skills, is a sense of theatre history, a sense of what theatre is about. And this is an interesting thing, because we are not expecting the reviewer to be a theatre historian or theatre scholar. There are people who have this kind of specialized knowledge, because you're also writing for popular readership. This is important. In a sense, you have to locate yourself in the space of, I suppose, the public intellectual, the public dimension of reviewing is very, very important. The ability to explain, to advocate, to lay readership, because that's how you develop the audience, right? I mean, if you're going to write academically, you'll be in all these like academic silos. No one really reads you outside of the academy. So that, I think, is, you have to sound like you are writing for an intelligent audience, but at the same time not with specialized information.
I mean, so I was just thinking about the idea of, I know I completely agree that is a revolving door. But then also I think contextually, I mean, looking at where the Straits Times is right now is very different to what the Straits Times was 20 years ago, for example, where it was more monolithic, and a critic could really, and having a rookie critic could really destroy or hurt artwork. I think now, as Lynn pointed out, with this flourishing of a lot of other platforms where reviewers don't necessarily have to write for one, like, or stick with a mainstream paper forever. And the other thing is that there's also the playing devil's advocate. You can't possibly also have one person sitting in that seat all the time. You know what I mean? Then it kind of eliminates all the kind of multiplicity of views. But the problem is, so I think it's yes. I mean, it's key and to have a long time reviewers who are very familiar with the scene and can look at trajectories, maybe not necessarily always with a certain outlet. And also, I think ST's role is very different now than it was then. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the role of a critic has kind of shifted, and I think if you do stay, I mean, we have sort of in a way the opposite problem in the UK, which is quite simply, some critics, well, I've been in my job at The Guardian for over 20 years, yeah? You could turn around and say, it's time for me to move over and somebody else to take my place, yeah? We have critics who have been in their jobs for 50 years. I think that cuts both ways. But I also think that it's up to the critic to actually broaden, their interests and what they do. I think what often happens with a critic, there comes a kind of point in their career where they become kind of quite fixed about what it is they like, what their outlook is, and that they could, and a sort of refusal to learn new vocabularies with new art forms. I think there is something about being enormously kind of trying to be open and trying to be, and just as I would say to young critics, what you need to do is see the greatest possible range of work that you can so that you are basically giving yourself an education. I actually think for us much older critics exactly the same thing applies, and that too often what happens is either we don't step out of our comfort zone, or editors go, oh, that's the person who likes Schiller, or that's the person who likes performance art, so I'll send that person to revere.
Corrie, when we in conversation with me, you've talked about this idea of the empathetic critic. Can you just maybe share a little bit more about that?
I'm still trying to articulate it and what that means. I think also there's something Lynn said earlier about the artist responding and given that room to respond. And I remember when I was at ST, there was this kind of mantra that you should not engage, which I really chafed at, because I was like, if not engaged, then what's the point, right? So I found myself talking to a lot of artists about how I was writing about their work, especially when I was a younger writer. And I also wanted to figure out how dramaturgy worked. So I actually, while I was still at ST, I don't know if this is bad, but I snuck off and I took part in the Necessary Stages Orange Playground program, where I observed how they created work. So over the course of like almost a year, I think. So really wonderful, and of course I studied theatre studies all throughout my life, but it was just wonderful to be in the black box space and to see how work was created, and to also understand how different the role of a dramaturg is from that of a critic. I think it really helped me to make that distinction, and also really talking to artists about their work. And I think what gives me, greatest satisfaction is when I can write a review that maybe it doesn't praise the work too high, and maybe there are some criticisms that I make, but I'm always very pleased when I do a critique and the artist writes to me and said, thank you for pointing out my intention so clearly, and you completely understood what worked and what didn't work with the show, and I welcome that you had that point of view and it was very useful to me. And then I'm like, oh, okay, I've done my job. That's kind of what I strive for. And there are times where I have, and I spoke to Lyn about this, I've massively regretted some stuff that I've written early on in my career. And I actually, a few years later, wrote to these artists and said, I'm so sorry, I didn't understand your work. I was, 23? I had no context of what you were doing. Yes, the work was flawed, but I would have contextualized it completely differently. And some really wonderful, conversations have arisen from that. So the idea of also, like what Lyn said, being a midwife and not some sort of arbiter of taste or gatekeeping, and really understanding what this community is, what the trajectories of their work are, what kind of intent they're striving for, really understanding the intent of the work. And then I think, and I mean, I'm human. Sometimes, I make wrong decisions, or I write a review that, sometimes you just have a bad night and you can't. It's also a creative practice. You also have to write something under a lot of pressure, and sometimes you make, you second guess yourself. You make the wrong call, but it's part of that continuum, of whether you're constantly engaging with artists and understanding the work that they're putting out. And I think in Singapore, in a much smaller scene, it can be quite, the responses can be quite personal, sometimes quite hard to navigate because the scene is really much smaller. When I was reviewing in London for The Guardian and for The Stage, I had a different problem in that it was lovely to be anonymous. I could just go into a show and no one would know who I was. But I had no cultural references. So all the stuff that I loved about Singapore that I could immediately bring to mind. In London, I'd be watching something and The Guardian would just send me for something and be like, oh my God, I have to do a lot of research. I have no idea what this is. So it's kind of the opposite issue, but interesting to see, how two very different communities work. Yeah.
I guess this is a question for Corrie, Lyn, maybe. So similarly, artists would look back at work that we've done when we were 22 and be ashamed of that as well. And hopefully we've been afforded or found ourselves systems of support and growth and development so that we get beyond that 22-year-old voice. So do you have any thoughts about how the critique develops themselves and keeps improving and sharpening? I mean, any thoughts or experiences you care to share?
I can only speak from my own experience. So I think I was very lucky that I could take a year away to do, I went to do my master's, and it was really a luxury, and it was really wonderful for me to kind of step out of the system I'd been in. Literally, I started interning at the Straits Times when I was 18. So literally, more than a decade with the same company. You hit a sort of plateau, and I think it's why I sought out opportunities like the Orange Playground or doing other sorts of work. And in London, I was very, very lucky to be able to write for 3 different publications that were very different in scope. So you have The Guardian, which I guess is the mainstream liberal newspaper there. So there's kind of a voice that The Guardian has, and it's usually about 400 to 800 words, depending on what our editors, what kind of review it is. Then I wrote for The Stage, which is really a question of discipline, because they do 250-word reviews. So you have to be really, really disciplined. It's kind of a first impressions take, and I tend to overwrite. So it was really a struggle. And then I also wrote for Exhumed magazine, which is long-form experimental reviewing. So that's 1,000 to 1,500 words. You could do it as a dialogue. Sometimes you have live Twitter updates. You could write from a very personal point of view. So I was able to cultivate 3 different forms of writing. And I think that was really useful to understand that there are different types of critics' voices for different publics and for different publications. And the people who read these publications are all different demographics as well. And I think, so I think that was part of my growth process, I think, to be able to have exposure to multiple levels of writing, yeah.
I mean, I think that's a really, what Corrie is saying, absolutely proves that, actually, funny enough, I said it to my workshop group this morning, just when we were wrapping up, writers write, and people, would-be writers, think about writing. And I think that one of the things is regularly writing, seeing as much as you can, and writing in as many different ways as you possibly can, until actually, I think in the same ways that an artist, discovers their own voice, I think one of the things that actually is that a critic eventually discovers their own voice, or at least I think often good critics actually do. But the other thing I'd like to sort of just add to that from my own personal experience is that, if I'm perfectly honest, I rather reckon that if the internet had not come along, I'm not sure that I would any longer be doing my job. My job would not be under threat because criticism would just have carried on the way that it carried on doing. But I think that one of the things that happened when the internet came along was that it made me realise much more this idea about that this was a possibility in some ways for me to actually I'm not saying that I am the only person who's ever done this, but I'm number 2 at The Guardian to Michael Billington, who is a kind of, hugely revered critic. And I was always going to be number 2, and that is the nature of the job. Like, in a sense, you get the leftovers, or from the reviews list of the things that he doesn't want to see. And when the internet kind of came along, I suppose it made me realise how much I was interested, and always had been interested, in as much in the idea of the process of theatre and how it was made, and in much broader questions about what is a theatre building for? What is its function? Why do we fund it? When we talk about kind of an audience, who is an audience? What does it mean? What is a community? And because the internet was there, and because The Guardian started to run blogs, I started to write more and more around those issues, and sometimes kind of would be a sort of almost a mixture of review and think piece about what it is that theatre might be. And at my most pretentious, I've often said, when people say, "Oh, you're a theatre critic," I go, "No, actually, I'm not. I'm somebody who's really lucky enough to be paid by The Guardian to think out loud about theatre."
Alfian, maybe you can actually talk about, you've been writing, you're well known as a playwright, but now you've also been, over the past few years, writing more and more as either a critic or someone that interrogates other artists' work. Right? And can you tell us a little bit about how you entered this space and why you think it's important?
Okay, so I'm actually leading up to answering this question, I'm going to answer that question about what kinds of reviews irk me, what kind of reviews annoy me. So, like Corrie mentioned just now, the prescriptive ones I find really annoying, like, this person should have done this, should have written this a certain way, should not have cast that person, those are really annoying, because the gut response is, then you do lah, right? Like, why don't you direct your own show? And then let us watch and let us decide whether your prescriptions play out in real life, because otherwise it's all just completely hypothetical, right? It's completely speculative. So I don't like those kinds of reviews. But I realized after a while that that fantasy of having the reviewer stage or direct or write their own stuff is not going to happen. So how I felt I could get my own back is to write better reviews than them also, I think. So that's one reason I go into reviewing, that, okay, I don't like your review, but I'm not going to prescribe to you how you should write it, but I'm going to try my hand at it and hopefully write better reviews than you. So that's how I deal with this annoyance. That's how I deal. So one can say I go into reviewing because I get so irritated by some of the reviews that I've seen. Yeah, and some of them a bit personal also. I don't like those. There's this International Association of Theatre Critics. I was just reading their code of practice, right? And just mentioning to Corrie, the second part I really liked, which says theatre critics should speak truthfully and appropriately while respecting the personal dignity of the artist to whom they are responding. Yeah, so I think that's just very important. You're not just talking about work. There are people who create this work. So I've seen some reviews which, the tone almost goes out to humiliate these artists, takes on a very superior position. So those are the ones I don't like, the ones where, it really gets personal and, as been mentioned, does not respect the dignity of the artist.
I have this is just a sort of personal little rule that I have for myself, which is, if it's a great big star who is appearing in the West End and the box office is being sold on the basis of that star name, then I think if it turns out that they are not very good, then I absolutely would, I would talk about that. But if in fact actually it's somebody, an actor in a small role or in an ensemble production, I absolutely will not mention them unless I can mention them positively. Because my view, actually, it is probably not their fault. They've probably either been cast wrong or maybe they've been directed wrong. And I think there is something about criticism that it is very hard. I think critics are often too fast to actually lay blame and say, oh, this is the director's fault, or this show is fantastic because of the design. And actually, we do not know what went on in the rehearsal room and who actually was responsible for all those different elements. But I think the thing about actors is that I have such admiration for actors. And the fact that, they go out there and do it every night. And just even if it's on the small possibility that they might have read what it is that I have said, I do not want them to have to go out there tomorrow night or tonight with what I've said if it was really negative kind of ringing in their ears. Funnily enough, actually, I was talking to a director recently who said that she absolutely tries to stop her cast, reading reviews, because she says if they're good reviews and they're mentioned positively, it also often has an effect. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's a way to, even if you critique negatively, right? I mean, you don't like someone's acting. So, for example, you don't say, oh, she can't act her way out of a wet paper bag or something like that, But I do see some critics who think that, okay, I get viewership because I'm bitchy or I'm sassy or I throw shade. And, there are some readers who enjoy this kind of writing and look at me, I'm having a power trip. So, I don't like those kinds of reviews.
I think that's also because there is a bit of that history which you alluded to earlier, the kind of infamous critics from, say, New York, where I think you could argue that their success was that they developed a very recognizable voice. There was almost a character or a persona. And I suppose the strength or contribution of that is that a person goes to read that article because they know that character and they know that character has a point of view and they're almost anticipating the way the writer is going to speak about this work. I think that obviously has massive limits, but I think it almost gets back to Fest kind of terrain where it really is incredibly limited and it's really just trying to stir curiosity and gossip and bitchiness, but it's not very critically helpful.
I think, though, one of the things that it's worth remembering, and I'm not doing this to say, oh, poor little critics, but actually, when Kathy asked earlier, who are you writing for? I think, if you are writing for a mainstream outlet, one of the answers to that question is you're writing for your editor. Yeah, because your editor is the person who commissions you and who actually you probably, if you're going to eat next week, you want to commission you again next week to write another 550 words. And of course, exactly the kind of reviews that you're talking about, editors love them. They absolutely love them. And one of my theories about the fact that actually the reason why theatre criticism often gets less space than, say, TV criticism and film criticism, which often does have that rather kind of flip, sarcastic, I'm going to be funny type review, is because, in fact, because actually editors prefer that to the theatre review, which I personally think that one of the reasons that it's much harder to write like that, even if you wanted to, and on the whole I don't, just occasionally I do really lay into something if I think it's incredibly cynical, and but is the fact that it is a live event. And there is something different between reviewing something that was in the can 6 months or a year ago and that is now being shown, maybe in fact in an entirely different world context, than something that is produced every night completely live.
And as a critic, what do any of you think in terms of personal preference and taste? And the part that plays and how honest or transparent one needs to be Or is it something you try to keep separate, or you have to declare, or do you kind of assume after a while that your readers understand it and can assume certain things?
Yeah, I think. So what I try to do, and because I also watch a lot of theatre, so it's impossible just to watch one style of it. I mean, Lyn definitely watches much more, but so I watch about 90 to 100 shows a year. So it's impossible to only see what you like. And also, I think the important thing about being a critic is you're able to separate personal taste from your job. And I try to go into everything not expecting anything, because there are certain assumptions you might make about what you think a show is that will surprise you. So I always go in with excitement or anticipation, because you don't really know what's going to take shape in the room. I think isn't that why we go to the theatre? That magic of it, the curtain or the darkness before the show begins. So that's the kind of attitude I hope to bring to, I think when I was younger, I did not have that, because you think, oh, I like this, I don't like this. But over time, when you start seeing a lot of stuff, then that kind of, things do surprise you in good and bad ways, about stuff, genres that you like or dislike. So I'm always open to that. Yeah.
I think the question sort of rather supposes that there is this objective critic who kind of somehow is going in as a completely blank slate, and responding to a show. A critic, I'm like any member of the audience, that we take our own baggage into the theatre with us, and that's whether, kind of the Uber went the wrong way, that it's raining, that we stood at the bus stop for half an hour before we got to the show, and whether or not we prefer Jacobean revenge tragedy to restoration comedies, or live art to circus. Yeah, of course we all have personal preferences. I think the point really about actually, as a critic is actually people often talk about critics and they say, "Oh, jaded critics." I kind of think that actually we're the opposite of supermodels. We don't get out of bed for $10,000 a day. Neither do we look like them. But actually, we couldn't possibly do our job unless we were huge optimists. Yeah, because the truth is, I think an awful lot of theatre is so-so. It's not really fantastic. It's not incredibly bad. It's just okay. That. And if you go to the theatre as often as I do, which is 5, 6, 7 times a week, then you have to retain a kind of optimism about it. So I might go into the theatre, and of course I will be thinking to myself, oh no, Antony and Cleopatra, and in the past my experience has been, that's not great. And yet, actually, of course, a great production of Antony and Cleopatra will absolutely blow me away,
We've talked about, coming back to the title about the start of conversation, right? So the idea is, perhaps it seems to be that the review, the critic, starts off by laying some kind of a position or an opinion, and then it forms a conversation either through the audience that responds or the artist that responds. Yeah. Can I ask each of you this question about the kind of cultural space in Singapore? Because, this is, and, is there that kind of cultural space for the kinds of conversation that we think our reviews, or you think that your reviews, will engender? And yes, because it seems as if we are speaking in some ways about this ideal world where the reviews that the informed critic writes opens up a conversation. Is there space, and is there a public out there that really wants to engage?
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. What I trying to formulate my thoughts. I think one thing I realized that I enjoyed very much about writing in London is the really lively debate that would take place in the comments after the review is published. And I mean, some of these readers are more erudite and well-informed and have watched much more than I have. And as Lynn said, they're incredibly perceptive and insightful, which did not help my panic at writing. But some of the stuff that really came up that was so well articulated. I mean, I really enjoyed that discussion. Like, oh wow, opening up to possibilities that I hadn't. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if the readership is smaller or people don't feel like they have the authority to comment, or they comment very privately, so there's no space to that discussion. Or I don't know if or it's done behind backs, or I don't know. But I would love to have more conversations, if that's the kind of conversation you're discussing, about people who really like the work, people who really disliked it. Kind of. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm still formulating my thoughts on this.
I think we've got a significant audience that clearly think theatre is and the performing arts are a valuable thing, and that are subscribing, and attending a lot. I'm not so sure yet how much we are excited about hearing a range of different views about those experiences. If we've enjoyed a show, whether we want to particularly read someone's scathing review of that piece because we'd prefer to just hold on to it, or if we really dislike the piece, are we open to hearing other views? I know even for myself, there's phases where I just really don't feel like reading reviews because I don't know, there's enough invading of my mind from other things, and I just want to protect some of my own thoughts. I mean, and there's seasons where I really, really want to read reviews, and I think somebody mentioned earlier, sometimes I can't make it to a show, so I desperately want to find reviews that will describe it to me so I can get lock in some sense of what the experience might have been like. So I think it shifts a lot. Yeah.
I feel that actually some of the writings by theatre critics that I enjoy are actually the kinds which are more opinion pieces, and the ones that try to connect a play to something wider in the culture. The kinds that look like, let's say, 3 different plays, and then say, okay, this is a commentary of the times that we are in. So I've seen Clarissa writing about that, you as well. Talking about arts funding or censorship, all arts-related issues. So I think that there is that kind of space. There's also a space for the kind of cliff notes, critics' reviews, which I think there are some people who actively seek out after they see a play which is really quite bewildering. And I think that's really a very important role for a critic, to make something a little bit more legible because you have a bit more context than the ordinary viewer or reader. And I also sometimes really appreciate this. Sometimes I do also watch something befuddling and like, what the heck? Go online and like, okay, what else are other people saying about it? And I learned, So I think there is that space, yeah.
I would be really presumptuous of me to actually identify things on the basis of 2 brief visits of Singapore, and the way that in some ways perhaps what happens culturally reflects the society itself. On the other hand, having seen all of 5 shows during, my time here, I guess I could say that probably there might be things that I might start to grope towards identifying, yeah? But what I do think is that I think that when there is a strong theatre, a conversation around theatre, that does encourage a strength in theatre. I think it can help validate theatre. And so therefore, that is one of the reasons, and I guess one of the reasons why I have been here this time, because I think that the Arts Council perhaps thought about, might there be ways to start trying to facilitate a much wider conversation about cultural activity in Singapore. And I think that can be a good thing. One of the things that I would say, and funny enough, it came back up again at the sort of end of the session this morning, but is, as Corrie probably is aware, in London, you would not be a theatre maker in the UK, and you would not be an arts journalist, or indeed any kind of journalist in the UK, and not be on Twitter. Yeah, and I understand that Twitter is not particularly big here, but I suppose I would just throw it out there that it might be a forum and a way of actually extending the debate around theatre. And though you can turn around and say, you know, what is it that anyone can meaningfully say in 140 or now 240 characters, nonetheless, actually, I think that one of the functions that Twitter has had in the UK is to not just broaden the conversation around theatre, but actually to, in some ways, prod it to go into particular directions and to be much more self-reflective.
Yeah, so I actually think if the panelists don't have any kind of closing thoughts, I think it'd be really interesting now to open it up to everyone here for your questions or your comments. Because we're recording this, please do speak into the microphones, and I'm going to give my mic to someone, to Meta. Thanks, Meta.
Yes, Kathy.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Hi there. I'm really interested in this role of the reviewer in like theater culture and the conversation and basically the marketing of theater and how you think, what your role is in terms of the marketing of theater. Because, okay, a little tiny bit of context. I'm an actor, writer, producer from Vancouver, Canada. And Lyn, you actually reviewed me at the Edinburgh Festival long years ago. And at it was, yes, thank you. At the Edinburgh Festival, we're very, it's very real that reviews can either sell tickets or not, right? So my first question basically is, in your minds, do you have a sense that, do you kind of write knowing that it might be used in eventual marketing and that what you say might actually be used in pull quotes on posters and stuff? And then the second part of that, though, is actually a more important question, which is if theater coverage overall is kind of mainstream theater coverage is lessening, and maybe even theater audiences, young audiences are going to Netflix. They're not attending theater as much anymore. Do you have a sense that in the marketing of theater in general, is there anything in your mind about getting audiences to show up to theater in general? So the marketing of theater, like, a show, but also marketing of theater in general. And maybe, Lyn, has that changed over time if with the advent of like Netflix and more opportunities for entertainment culture?
Would it be? Shall I? No, sorry. I feel I've talked quite a lot. I absolutely do not think it is my job to sell tickets. Yeah. However, I'm absolutely aware that as far as companies and theatres are concerned, what I say might sell tickets. Edinburgh, I think, is a very particular hothouse situation where, having said that nobody, has the kind of critical clout of Frank Rich in New York, where I think in Edinburgh maybe a few critics, of which I guess I probably am one, actually can make a big difference to a show. But no, I certainly never think about the pull quote. I would certainly never write my review in that way. And actually, I think the truth is that probably the most interesting reviews to read and that often are most perceptive are the ones that are least full of pull quotes. Yeah. I always think it's kind of quite interesting that no artist is ever in a million years going to complain about the review that gushes, yes? They're going to complain, and go, oh, she got it completely wrong if you don't like something. But actually, if you gush about something, and completely misunderstood it, but give it kind of 4 or 5 stars, then of course actually the artists are never going to complain about that. And in a way, the reason I kind of raise that is that I think there is something interesting, and I see it, and I'm very pleased to see it, that it doesn't seem to happen here, that reviews are not starred. But in the UK, all reviews are starred. All critics hate it. Yes, I would say that artists say that they hate it, but of course when they get 4 or 5 stars, they are then complicit and they paste it all over the outside of their theatre. And my view about that is that actually artists need to stop being complicit in that kind of marketing strategy. Having said it, I quite understand that if you're a small company and putting something on that you will, yeah. Does that sort of answer what?
Yeah, totally. The first part, yeah. And I'm interested in the second part about like the marketing of theater in general. Bringing audiences in. Are you aware at all?
I slightly disagree with that. About the idea that people are less interested in theatre. I think that in an odd way, in the age of kind of Netflix and box sets and sitting at home kind of poured over your screen, that there is something enormously appealing about the live experience. Having said that, I also feel, I actually find myself immensely touched and think that it's an absolute miracle that in this age of Netflix, etc., that still on a wet Wednesday evening, that all these people gather at 7:30 or 8 o'clock at the NAFTA Theatre or at some fringe theatre in London in order to see, a show. So I think that there is still a hunger for that. But one of the things that I really would say, and I don't know how much that applies here, but certainly in the UK, one of the things that I think a lot is that I think theatres and companies need to stop being so transactional in their relationship with audiences, because I think the idea that actually you're only really interested in your audience because they're going to buy a $25 ticket, is actually not the relationship that you want to have with your audience. And that if people feel that actually that's the only reason you're really interested in them, then actually you are going to be hard-pressed to actually develop your audiences. I think audience development is less about marketing and much more about talking about what is the relationship between audience and artists, about making theatre with audiences rather than for audiences, and about theatres and companies thinking about what is our role and who is the community we are serving and how and what are we doing for that community.
Can you take another question? Oh, sorry, unless anyone else wants to.
Yeah. So just that bit about pull quotes, really interesting for me because so I work at a theatre company, there's a marketing department, they love taking out pull quotes from different reviews. And then sometimes it's not completely honest because they take one part here and then ... and they take another part, right? So, and sometimes it's true, this idea, we have to think beyond this marketing and pushing the work, because I do see this problem, which is that since the barrier for entry for reviewing is now so much lower than before, because anyone can come up with a blog and become a reviewing site, for example. And then there are instances when there are people who only write good reviews, maybe in the hope that a theatre company might take out a pull quote from that. And then they get featured in the publicity material, but actually otherwise they're not really like a newspaper or record, they're just a blog site, right? And this is happening, and I don't think it's healthy, because I have a feeling, okay, it's just a suspicion, that some of these reviews only write good reviews because they think this is going to secure them the tickets for the next shows, etc. That they need to shill for the theatre company. I think this is quite a problem where perhaps they become a kind of unofficial PR arm almost of the theatre company. This is quite problematic. And I think with, even in my theatre company, I always tell the marketing department, do we really need to quote from this site, even though it's a very, very good review? But I feel that they only write good reviews. So the problem is then their credibility is quite suspect. And by pulling out their quotes, we are legitimizing them, you know, and it's such a big... And then on the other hand, my publicity marketing side will say, oh, but none of the mainstream papers watch this, like, let's say a Young and Wild, you know, youth department play, you know, and only they did. So we are so scarce with reviews, we need to use them, you know. So there's this huge debate, yeah.
Hi, thanks for sharing all your insights so far. It's been really great. I just want to ask you guys about what you think. I know you guys mentioned things like Twitter and the availability of platforms, digital platforms for people to start or continue conversations. But beyond that, what else do you think theatre criticism can delve into? And comparison I would give is, for example, for film, right? For film criticism, a new form has emerged as the film essay, and I really enjoy that because I feel that it bridges academia and something that is more for the layman. So how do you think that could happen for theatre? Because I understand that maybe film essays makes more sense for film, but in theatre it's probably a bit difficult to try and translate that kind of thing. But yeah, just in terms of like a digital platform, what do you think is a new form that could emerge?
I think that's something we're trying to do at ArtsEquator. No, I completely agree. I think there's a possibility to have discursive work that kind of, I mean, it depends on the platform you're on as well. I mean, maybe it's difficult for a mainstream platform to have constantly these kind of, it takes a lot of time to think and ponder, you know, different aspects and how you're going to put them together to do a discursive work, and it takes more academic research sometimes. So it may not be possible all the time, but I think it's definitely something, you know, to ponder how theatre is made and looking at different trends, and I think it's definitely something good that, yeah, and hopefully more platforms, especially online platforms, can do the theatre essay, or, you know, do like what Alfian does, kind of thematic reviews that draw from current context and stuff like that. Yeah.
I also think there's an issue of the medium in the sense that the film is a document, or let's say a DVD, you can watch it over and over again, you know, and a novel as well. So you can go into a certain granularity with it that maybe you can't do so much with theatre unless you have a lot of money and you're going to watch the same play 30 times or something. But otherwise, I think, you know, as an artifact, it's something that's quite temporal. You watch it once and you try to process as much as possible from that viewing.
Sorry. My question is sort of relating theatre to a narrative, because there's a lot of research in the area of linguistics and narratives and how narratives are formed, and that talk about reminiscing, so talking about what you have experienced. And they found that when you reminisce, you actually retain more of what the original thing that you experienced was. So if you play a game about a fake zoo, and then the next day you ask your child, hey, do you remember what we played yesterday? They're more likely to remember a week's time. Do you remember what we talked about last week about playing about the zoo? Do you think that like your critical reviews and in general theatre reviews can actually change the way that we think and remember the things that we experience?
I think, sorry, I was just thinking about the idea of memory, and this is something I was thinking about recently, but there's also the converse is also true, in that whenever you remember something, you corrupt it, because you impose your own perceptions of what you think happened in that event, and it alters the things that we remember most fondly may be actually completely corrupted by the act of remembering and changing what we think actually happened in that moment. So I think both could, you know, both could work. It could be a record of something, you know, it could be more memorable in that kind of discourse, but it could also be completely tainted by that specific person's like kind of perspectives. Yeah, which also brings me to the fact that the more the merrier, I suppose. You know, that you can draw from a variety of different perspectives about the same work, because that's the beauty of it, isn't it? That every one of us has different reference points in every work that we go to. We'll pick out different things based on our own personal experiences. Some scenes will leap out at us. Other people may not even remember that scene at all. So I think that the health of critical discourse is also in the number of perspectives that are produced.
Hello. Thank you for your insights. This question might arise from my own limited knowledge, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But in my experiences with theatre and reviewers in Singapore, I find that we operate on this paradigm that the reviewer should come to the show and see the show for the first time that night that they are going to write the review. But it seems that there's a general sentiment among all of you that knowledge of the process, knowledge of the rehearsal process, the artistic process might make for a better and more nuanced review. So what do you think of the idea of the reviewer kind of being considered not just someone who arrives on show day and then writes about the show afterwards, but as someone who actually should actively participate in the rehearsal process or at least be there before the show to be in conversation with the artist already before they write the review? What do you think of that?
Can I? So actually, I think there's part of that work done when the journalist does the preview. So that's the part when they interview the artist and try to find, okay, what are you going to do with this work? And later on, when you actually watch it, then you're able to sort of try to see whether what was intention was actually achieved in the execution. So I think there's a bit of that. I don't think so that the artist should be this embedded kind of a journalist in the whole process and watch every single rehearsal, though. I think you can gather a bit of this information through that interview for the preview, for example.
Also, I think to bear in mind that what the audience is watching is the work. The audience is not watching the process. They're watching what you put out, the final product. So there's some sense that you're also evaluating what the public has access to, because the public is not going to have access to rehearsals or those might help inform you personally in following an artist's work. Sometimes they don't have the opportunity to do the interview, and I think certainly for in ST, for example, we would double up where we would do the preview and a review, but certainly in other places that the division of labor is more specific, where the reviewer is just a reviewer and there's just access to the kind of preview, as it were. So yeah, bearing in mind that what the audience sees is the product, that some knowledge is helpful, maybe too much knowledge may not be helpful. I'm not sure it's a balance. Yeah, I don't know what Lyn might think about this.
Yeah, I write reviews and previews. That would be features, but I would never review a piece about which I had specifically written a preview. It may be that what I've done is, and indeed, know a lot about the artist's work and maybe in an ongoing dialogue with them. But I don't want to, you are hugely influenced if you write a preview and you go and talk about with the artist about what it is that they're intending to do and what their purpose is. And of course, inevitably, that is what you then see in the production. So I think there needs to be a kind of separation in that moment. The other thing that I would also say is that, and it may not apply here, but one of the things I do note that's happening in the UK is creeping into theatre marketing and PR is a huge tendency on the part of the people who are the PRs and of theatre companies that they want previews, they do not want reviews. And I think, actually, we can say why that is the case, because the preview is always, in a sense, of being positive and can, of course, be kind of quite puff-like, whereas the review does indeed have room that it might express, it may not be entirely positive. And I would say that that's something that I think, that does concern me. And I think it's one of the things that absolutely is being affected by the cuts in space. So often now, I would say in The Guardian, it's come down to the fact that we will often if we do a preview of something, it might mean that we never review it. Whereas in the past, we always would, and the two go hand in hand and are part of that documentary record that you're talking about. Yeah.
Can I answer just step outside of my moderator? So I'm just thinking about the context in Malaysia, for example, where in the 1960s and in the 1970s, there was quite a conscious effort amongst the young intellectuals that had, had come back and were at the forefront of contemporary theatre movement to actually do that. So it would be very common for someone like a Christian Jit, for example, or who wrote under the name of Ute, or even someone like Antaras Kitley, to attend rehearsals. So not previews, but to sit in perhaps in some of the rehearsals. And then their pieces would be written, often with reference to their experience in the rehearsal room. And the reviews that were written then from that time actually, as a researcher, have become very valuable documents for theatre researchers. So, you know, I think that was a particular moment. I would actually say that if it was a new form, I think it'd be interesting to actually have the review, someone who's writing about it go in, but maybe then you don't call it a review. It's a different kind of creature that may sit on the same platform, but, you know, it's clearly marked. But so I would just say that I don't know if we can just say right now that, no, this is not something we would do, right? Sorry. Any more questions?
Just to add to that bit I said about all these blog reviewers writing, you know, uniformly good reviews, I think there's also the responsibility on the part of the theatre companies to assure people that just because you write bad reviews of our shows doesn't mean we're going to stop inviting you, right? I think that's also important that yeah, they need that kind of reassurance. And you know, it brings me to mind the Hong Sin Yi from the Straits Times, who was a theatre critic. 2003, 2004, right? And do you know this? You're also young, some of you are not. So, but the situation was that TheatreWorks, theatre company, felt that Hong Sin Yi was just apparently very hostile to the theatre company, and she kept producing quite negative reviews of TheatreWorks plays. And then they decided she is not welcome to any more of our shows. Yeah. So that was a decision that they made. So I think this is quite problematic, you know. And at the end of the day, Live Theatre Awards gave Ong Keng Sen Best Director. I don't know whether that was penance or whether there's any kind of relation you can draw between that. But yeah, that was a kind of a breakdown between a theatre company and a critic relationship.
Something with Cirque du Soleil recently.
Yeah, I got that.
Oh, really?
Yes. I actually have the ignominy of actually recently being banned would be too strong a word. I had reviewed a number of Cirque du Soleil productions, and last year reviewed a Cirque du Soleil production, and actually would be an example of writing a review of a show that I thought was so cynical. It was a version of The Tempest, kind of, or inspired by The Tempest, with a big love story at the middle of it. They changed the Ferdinand character to the name of Romeo, in case we didn't realise he was a lover. As that. And, you know, it was a review in which I was very scathing. I described it as being as erotic as a wet wipe. And I sort of do stand by that thing. Anyway, what happened this year was that they invited me to indeed review this year's show, and I think then somebody got round to reading last year's review, and they immediately uninvited me, of which actually, of course, the response quite correctly by The Guardian, you know, were very supportive. And what The Guardian decided to do was that I should just go ahead and buy a ticket for the show, which they would then reimburse me on, and they would use the press ticket that was available to send another critic, and we wrote a kind of two-headed review of the show, of our responses to it. So, you know, there are ways and means of dealing with that, but I think it's absolutely true that, again, that companies can't have it both ways, in the way that they want the reviews, but they only want them if they're positive. And I think, actually, you know, though, in fact, all critics, whether you're a mainstream critic like myself or, in fact, you're a blogger, it is possible to misuse the power which whether it's quite a large amount of power or a small amount of power that comes with that. I also think that it's really important that artists think about their part in that contract, and that quite simply that they don't abuse it by saying, yeah, you're a blogger and actually we'll only let you keep on coming and giving you the tickets if you write nice stuff about us.
Do we have some final questions before we close? Yes. Maybe we'll take 2 more questions.
Yeah, thanks for all your insights and stuff. I was thinking just now about one of the questions Kathy asked about asking you guys, do you think there is an audience that wants to continue the dialogue about theatre in the spirit that you guys intend? And there's maybe not so many hard answers to that at the moment. And then I think that sort of tied in with when Lyn mentioned Singapore doesn't use Twitter as much as you do in the UK, so there's not so much of a... You go and see your show and then you might talk about it with people who you don't know, like the way you can do on Twitter with other shows. It tends to be very word of mouthy and that kind of stuff. So basically my question is, how do you think we can move in that sort of direction of wider public dialogue rather than just, oh, I don't want to hurt people's feelings, so I'll just say it to my friend privately kind of thing?
So I don't see so much of the Twitter chatter, but I do see quite a bit of the chatter on Instagram, for example. So nowadays, right, a lot of theatre companies go, okay, at this curtain call, okay, you can take out your phones and take the photo of everyone bowing, and you can hashtag, and then people will hashtag, people will put up their money shot of the play, which is, oh, I was here, I came to watch this. And then there's always accompanied by, some brief review, or if they don't want to do that, they might link to another review, or maybe the Straits Times describe it better than I can. So I think there's a little bit already of that kind of discourse, whether the question about going deeper, I guess, is... we have to leave it up to, we can't push, right? We can't be so paternalistic about these things. So we can't nanny them all the way. If they want to seek those things out, I think, they can blog, they can write themselves,
At the same time, I mean, I find this idea, for example, of the idea of the post-show talk, for example, can be quite contentious. Like, I know there's a lot of artists that find it very tiresome. I've always found it incredibly interesting, but there's times where I don't feel like being in one, But what I like about a post-show talk is that it immediately, and this kind of comes back to what you were saying, it is a direct way of saying we appreciate you as an audience and we do want to know what you think. And we want to, I know when I create shows and festivals, I want to know what every single person thinks. And I try to find out as much as possible. And, it's very different when you get the feedback from outside. That is often very broad strokes. It's really marketing and PR kind of material more than it is engagement and critical input. But I think artists can think more about how to message and reinforce to our audience that we genuinely want to know what you're thinking and feeling and how you're engaging with our work.
I would say that in the UK, on Twitter, as I say, all arts journalists are on Twitter, particularly all theatre journalists and most companies and many, many artists are on Twitter. And one of the great things about Twitter is how much you choose or do not choose to engage, and about the fact that you can just take Twitter holidays and things like that, which I do all the time. But one of the things I really notice is that I almost don't follow any theatres at all. And the reason for that is otherwise, if I look at my Twitter feed at 10:10, when the marketing department has just got into work, there is an endless retweeting of all the positive things that people said on Twitter last night. And my view about that is it makes me go, but I want to know about the negative ones as well. And I think the real misunderstanding on the part of companies and theatres often is that they see social media, whether it's Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or whatever it might be, as being a broadcast medium and part of their marketing strategy. It isn't. It's it's a conversational medium, yes? And it is a place where people can have conversations. It's not a place where people just are trying to sell things. And I think that people who are on those social media immediately see through when actually that all it is that something is being sold to them. So I think in terms of kind of, changing the nature of that dialogue, it is about actually, being prepared to engage in a really genuine dialogue, yes, in some ways. And in some ways, in a very small way, I think probably this afternoon is sort of part of, that attempt to actually broaden what the dialogue is in Singapore and how it operates, and, and that there might be things that could be taken away from it.
We have time for one more question, if there is. Actually, I think that's a good note to end the panel on. Thank you. I'd like to say thank you to the National Arts Council for their support in making Lyn's 5-day trip here possible, and for making this event possible as well, and for their investment in critical writing. We also want to thank Centre 42, Yan Ling and Gwen and her team, Daniel, for their help and for always saying yes when ArtsEquators ask them for anything. To M1 Singapore Fringe Festival, Jasmine and her team that have been with us and through the conceptualizing of this project, and for also including this event within the Let's Walk program. LaSalle College of the Arts, who at the last minute came in and saved our behinds with a venue, because we were having trouble with the workshop venue that we had. LaSalle Arts Management students who are here, as well as Republic Poly Arts Management students, have been working with ArtsEquator for the past 4 months on a number of projects. We really, please be appreciative of all the young future producers and theatre managers and stage managers that you see outside. We've worked really hard. And finally, thank you very much to Lyn Gardner, Sean Tobin, Corrie Tan, and Alfian Sa'at. Thank you.